I think that when you believe someone is powerful, you in a way give them power and you make it more difficult for yourself to work against that person's interests. So I've never really done a video on politics before. I don't think that in general it's a useful topic or a helpful topic. But when it comes to understanding the political situation, I think a lot of people have the idea that someone is driving the bus. So just as background, let me give an overview as I see it. I think that the first thing to understand about societies is that they work on the principle of collective consciousness, and that within a society there are various groups which overlap, and each group can be seen as having its own collective consciousness. And yes, in the West, our society is run largely by oligarchs, and you could look at it as the oligarchs' collective consciousness, which is the strongest influence running our society. And who are the oligarchs? Well, they're the people that control the largest corporations, and especially the banking industry, because the banking industry can create money for itself, and so it ultimately is able to buy up control over the other facets of the economy. And the other facets of the economy are controlled to a much larger degree than most people realize by monopolies. And so the second tier in the system is basically people who control the large corporations which monopolize most facets of our economy on a macro scale. Now you can argue endlessly about the degree to which this power is concentrated or the degree to which it operates in secret, but that's not really the point of this video. I wanted to make a video because when people talk about the New World Order or basically about these oligarchs, they always seem to have a sense of awe and fear, as if there's some grand mystery, some grand intelligence behind it. People spend enormous amounts of time obsessing on this topic and ultimately convincing themselves that they, the individual, is weak and that this massive conspiracy is so strong and intelligent. And that's really counterproductive if it's not based in reality. So let me go over the reality as I see it. First of all, the way collective consciousness works, in my opinion, is fairly amazing and maybe can even seem a little supernatural to an individual, but that's not unique to the collective consciousness of oligarchs. Let's really analyze who these people are, and I'm going to get into some specifics later in the video, so please bear with me. But the top tier of people who own the corporations, and particularly the banks, they've largely inherited their position. So they're not at all a meritocracy. They're basically what's historically been called idiot sons. The second tier of people who have worked their way up through this system also are not a meritocracy in the sense of a productive meritocracy, because when you have a monopoly, there's no need for production. The skill set that's needed to work your way up through a monopoly is basically being a sycophant, kissing up. These people were traditionally called courtiers. Now, of course, I'm treating everything with a really broad brush, and there's so much overlap. I'm not suggesting that our society doesn't have a lot of elements of meritocracy. We're probably more of a meritocracy than most societies. But unfortunately, over the years, every society becomes more and more monopolistic. Power gets concentrated and inherited to a greater degree as the society becomes more corrupt, and this is basically how societies collapse almost always. There's nothing unique or special about it. As an aside, that's why I feel it's so important to protect freedom in free markets, because that ultimately protects a meritocracy, whereas once you have monopolies of power and concentration of power, you tend to have an entirely different skill set that is needed to attain leadership of those monopolies. Either leadership is inherited or the skill set is basically schmoozing, being a sycophant. So it produces an entirely different type of leader, a leader which is really incompetent. Let me give a few specific examples to help dispel the myth of a sinister and brilliantly planned New World Order. In the United States, the top oligarch is probably David Rockefeller, someone who inherited his position and who's hired as his spokesperson Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's basically a courtier. And despite the fact that these people portray themselves in their own media as the elites, they've really made a big mess of U.S. foreign policy. Zbigniew Brzezinski gave a pretty good speech a while back talking about the threats to the Western establishment, one of which was an anti-Western sentiment that was growing in Russia, kind of something in the news right now. But when you really look at the causes of that, you see that we blew an enormous opportunity we had with Russia. If the Western establishment had been looking for more mutually beneficial relationships with Russia rather than just trying to leech as much as they could out of Russia during the collapse of the Soviet Empire, we would be in a much better position. But since these people are oligarchs who don't know any better and whose only skill set is stealing, that's all they could think to do at the time. It all kind of boils down, though, to one specific event. There was a lot of course, a lot of things laid the groundwork for Putin's election and the anti-Western sentiment that drastically changed the direction Russia could have gone in. The number one thing, though, I think you can pin it on is the aerial bombing of Belgrade. This was really an arrogant thing to do and kind of the final straw, which turned Russia even more anti-Western. And within a year, Putin had begun his quick rise to power on an somewhat anti-Western platform, which he's maintained ever since then, to the great detriment of the West. It was just a way to push around Russia while they were down, and everyone who paid attention at the time knew that it was a very foolish thing to do. And who was responsible for this? Well, it was Madeleine Albright's policy, but Madeleine Albright was the protege of Zbigniew Brzezinski. This had Zbigniew Brzezinski's fingerprints all over it because Zbigniew Brzezinski is an emotionally somewhat unstable person who hates the Russians because of his family history in Poland. And he takes every chance he can get to antagonize the Russians needlessly. So, when Zbigniew Brzezinski gives a speech talking about how it's so unfortunate that the Russian people and government have turned against the West, he, more than any other individual, is responsible for that. Of course, there are countless collective reasons why these things happen, but it was Zbigniew Brzezinski's stupidity and emotional immaturity that led him to make a blunder like this for emotional reasons, a terrible blunder. And it's not something that you see in hindsight. Everyone at the time who was paying attention knew that it was a terrible blunder. The problem is that these oligarchs and their sycophant courtiers aren't living in the real world. They don't deal with the average Russian. They fly from five-star hotel to five-star hotel, never really in touch with the damage that they're doing and the hubris that they have. That was fun, let me do another. So people may think, well, the Rockefellers and their idiot advisor may make huge mistakes, but not the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds being another large, powerful banking family who at this point are just inheriting their position and don't really have any skill at anything, and so of course they do make huge mistakes. One thing they've cared about historically is Jewish causes, and this illustrates why it's so dangerous for people, even if they have the best of intentions, for incompetent people like this to get control of your destiny. In my opinion, one of the reasons that the Jewish people were so successful historically is that they never really had a central leadership which could become corrupt and take down the entire society the way almost every other society has done. And this is why America was so successful for quite some time, because we never had a strong centralized leadership. We were very individualistic also. Now, I know this is really controversial, and you're welcome to discuss it in the comments section, but I do think it's important for one reason, because many people seem to have this idea that there's a Jewish conspiracy as part of the New World Order. And I think if you look at the facts, exactly the opposite is indicated, that the Jewish people have suffered more than anyone else under the incompetent leadership of idiot sons. The Balfour Proclamation that was negotiated by the Rothschild idiot son on behalf of the Jewish people basically sided with the British in World War I and pledged Jewish support for the British in World War I. A pretty stupid thing to do, considering that far more of the Jewish people lived in Germany at the time. And the Balfour Proclamation, although it's never really discussed because it's an embarrassing fact, the Balfour Proclamation is the number one concrete thing you can point to that led to the rise of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. It was a devastatingly bad mistake on the part of the Rothschilds, and only a very arrogant, very foolish person would do such a thing. The second outcome of the Balfour Proclamation was an extremely clumsy attempt at military occupation of Palestine. Aliyah had been going on organically for generations and probably could have been sustained and continued to be successful. But by turning the entire endeavor into a military colonization, the Rothschilds put the remainder of the Jewish people in basically the same position as the Crusaders, only with nuclear weapons thrown into the mix. It may be controversial, but I don't think a detached view would show that a clumsy, rapid attempt at military colonization of Palestine was a good idea. That's exactly what the Crusaders tried, and long term, I question whether you should place the entire destiny of a people on that kind of a decision. But this is what always happens when leadership gets usurped by corrupt and incompetent people. Corrupt and incompetent people who inherited their position or got to their position simply by kissing up and working their way through a monopoly. When people are so detached from the real world, they just can't help but make terrible mistakes. And when people don't have good ethics, it always comes back to haunt them in the end. And that's why, every society ultimately collapses, because this type of incompetent leadership comes about. And when you believe that there is some all-powerful, extremely knowledgeable group out there that is driving the bus, it's a very incorrect belief, I believe, and a very dangerous belief, because you give your power over to these people when you believe that they have some ability. They don't have any ability. They shouldn't be in charge, and the sooner you recognize their incompetence and take back your own power, the better.